Ships that should have been museums. It's a popular topic to cover in naval history circles. This can revolve around personal bias in wanting a favorite ship preserved, or alternatively, it can involve famous ships that people feel should have been saved. It can also be both, admittedly. In the latter case, the most common example is probably USS Enterprise, a highly decorated and historically significant ship. Perhaps the single most significant ship in the United States Navy at the time, and a ship that is the classic example of why wasn't she saved. The short answer, of course, is Enterprise was scrapped before museum ships were a common thing. As for the longer answer, well, I'll go over that in this video. I covered it briefly before as part of a longer video. This one will focus entirely on Enterprise. Let's get into it now. USS Enterprise, the ship that stood against Japan, was decommissioned soon after the Pacific War ended. Specifically, she was out of service in January of 1946, and formally decommissioned on February 17, 1947. This isn't particularly surprising. Enterprise was old, small, and beaten up. The ship was nowhere near as capable as the Essex class, and quite a few of those ships were also decommissioned. It was a time of drawdowns and consolidations with the war over. At that point, Enterprise entered into a sort of limbo. There were powerful voices calling for the ship to be saved, even that early. Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, was one such voice. To directly quote him, as early as August of 1945, "I think it is an appropriate ship to take its place with the Constitution, the Constellation, the Hartford, and the Olympia as the historical vessels in the American Navy." As for Enterprise, Forrestal wasn't alone in wanting to save the ship. President Truman was also on record in November 1945 of not wanting to scrap the ship. The president stated that he would be grieved if he had to sign the documents declaring her for scrapping. However, powerful voices were not enough. Enterprise would languish in limbo for a little over a decade as various plans fell apart, until ultimately the ship was scrapped in 1958. There's a particularly famous photo of the decommissioned Enterprise alongside USS Independence. Seeing the Big E dwarfed by the supercarrier drives home how long the ship lasted. How did it come to that point, however? Well, the first plan to save Enterprise came very early. In 1946, according to Friedman, the ship was going to be handed over to the state of New York for preservation. One assumes that a berth in New York City, like USS Intrepid is to this day. However, this plan fell apart. It was passed around until 1949, at which point it was suspended. Exactly why it was suspended, I'm not sure. Most likely it came down to New York not putting up whatever money the Navy was asking for. In any event, the next, and most famous attempt, came in the 1950s. Enterprise had been laying about in reserve for a decade, changing designation all the while. Her final designation being CVS-6 as an anti-submarine support carrier. That came in 1953. In 1954, soon after that, the USS Enterprise CV-6 Association was formed. This was a group of former crewmen who would become the core of efforts to save the ship. This came in 1956, when the Navy decided against keeping the ship in reserve. By that point, Enterprise was outdated and not worth keeping around, even as a reserve combat ship. With the aircraft carrier now at real risk of the scrapper's torch, the association stepped up. A publicity drive was launched, with Admiral Halsey himself joining in to help. This culminated in putting a resolution through Congress to save Enterprise as a memorial in Washington, D.C. That resolution passed in August 1957. There was, however, a catch. The Navy would only hand the ship over if the association could pay for everything. Repairing the ship, preserving her, moving her, and dredging the berth in D.C. the latter part coming from the National Park Service. The real kicker, though, they were only given 6 months to raise the money, because while this was going on, the Navy was also looking for bids on her disposal and scrapping. They weren't going to spend the money themselves or give much time to raise money. That cost came out to between $1 to $2 million in 1957 money, roughly $11 million to $22 million in today's money. For reference, the Texas government provided $35 million for the work done on USS Texas over the last couple years. And that took years of work, plus the ship almost sinking at her moorings, to get done. Not a few months of frantic fundraising. As could be expected, this was an impossible task. It wasn't enough time, and the money simply wasn't there. Enterprise would ultimately be scrapped, with the work concluding by 1960. A few pieces did survive, from her nameplate to portholes on her successor, CVN-65. What didn't survive was her distinctive tripod mast. That had been earmarked for the Naval Academy's football stadium, but it was also scrapped in the end. When looking at pictures of the scrapping, you can see other things that were destroyed. A pilot's ready room, sitting like it was waiting for a briefing. The list of her accomplishments in the hangar. The bridge and mast. And, of course, the hull itself, cut down towards the waterline as the scrapping progressed. All of this is a shame, but not a surprising result. Quite ignoring the impossible money goal, this was a different time. You'll note that, outside outliers like Texas or Constitution, most museum ships came about in the 1960s and onwards. That's not a mistake. These were ships that were kept around in reserve for longer. By the 1960s, there was more of a desire to preserve museum ships that hadn't been there in the 1940s or 1950s. That's why you see ships like North Carolina or Alabama sticking around. And the Iowas, of course, survived by virtue of being in service until the 1990s. It's also worth noting that North Carolina required $250,000 by way of comparison. Part of that is economic conditions changing. Most of it, however, is down to the condition of the ship. North Carolina was kept in reserve longer, but it was reserved with more of a chance of coming back to service. The ship was kept in better shape, and more importantly, was in better shape to begin with. A ship like North Carolina or Massachusetts was easier to fix up as a museum. Enterprise was used and abused, which is in large part where the cost on her came from. It's no surprise that it was cheaper on these later ships. Enterprise's fate is a sad one, though it might be because of her end that museum ships saw a resurgence. It drove home how these ships could be lost, made a sense of urgency that wasn't there before. It's a shame we lost Enterprise, but perhaps her end helped preserve the other museums. That's not a bad legacy either. And for what it's worth, at least some of her crew wanted it that way. They didn't want snot-nosed kids running around where shipmates had died. I can understand the logic, even if I don't necessarily agree as a historian. Regardless, the legacy of USS Enterprise has endured and will continue to endure, even without the ship herself. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.